Our third presenter is Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes, who is an associate professor at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. He was awarded the National Academy of Science and Technology Outstanding Young Scientist in Economics in 2014. He specializes in applied econometrics with focus on labor and migration, education, poverty, and inequality. Please welcome with me Dr. Geoffrey Ducanes.
Good morning. Can you hear me? So it's an honor to be presenting here together with colleagues and other esteemed guests. I will be presenting on the estimated impact on Philippine employment and poverty of COVID-19 and the lockdown. So let me just note first that my presentation is based on some ongoing and completed research, mainly this, including a paper I'm currently writing with Professor Arsenio Balisacan, currently of the Philippine Competition Commission. The structure of my presentation will be as follows. So first, I will give an introduction. Here, I will define the measures of poverty which I will use and describe the mechanism by which COVID-19 affects household income and poverty. Next, I will describe the documented impact of COVID-19 on employment based on the most recent labor force survey. I will then present the results of our estimation of the impact of COVID-19 on income poverty, and then present on the further welfare effects of COVID-19, especially on education enrollment. Finally, I will give a summary and recommendations. So COVID-19 is a health pandemic that is causing social and economic crisis everywhere in the world, including the Philippines. So we now have a keen awareness of its economic impact, but I think we are only seeing the beginnings of its social consequences. From our own experiences, of course, we know that it has affected how we relate to other people, constrained the activities we can take part in, and the things we can enjoy. As I will discuss, it has also had an extraordinary effect on employment. This, of course, we can also see with our own eyes, and we think it will have an extraordinary effect also on poverty, as we should expect. It will also have an impact on other aspects of well-being, such as on the education of the young, non-COVID-19 health outcomes, and even our psychological well-being. Forecasts made by multilateral organizations as of June 2020 predicts the world economy will decline by about 5% this year. If you have been following the forecast, you will realize that as time goes by, the forecasts keep getting worse. So this is likely going to go down further. The International Labour Organization estimates that about 400 million full-time jobs were lost worldwide in the second quarter of the year. And that while some recovery is likely to occur during the rest of the year, by the fourth quarter of 2020, it is still projected that employment will be down about 140 million full-time jobs. This is for the world. The COVID-19 induced economic crisis is unlike economic crises in recent history, such as the global financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis, in the severity and the spread of its effect. It really affects all economies, whether advanced, emerging, or developing. Note that before the crisis, global economic output was expected to grow by more than 3%. So now, it is expected to contract by 5%. This means that global output this year is more than 8% lower than it likely would have been without COVID-19. Advanced economies are projected to contract by 8% this year, with output 10% lower than without COVID-19. Emerging and developing markets in general, contraction of 3%, and output 8% lower than without COVID-19. emerging and developing Asia, where we belong, expected contraction of only 1%, but 7% lower than without COVID-19. Because of course, developing countries were also expected to grow much faster. The IMF expects the Philippines to contract this year by 2% compared to an initial projected growth of more than 6%. By now, this will be considered a very optimistic projection. Some analysts forecast the economy will contract by more than 6% this year. So that will be a 12% decline for what was expected before COVID-19. So let me go to the presentation proper. So COVID-19 will impact poverty mainly through its impact on employment and loss of earnings. There are three main mechanisms by which COVID-19 impacts employment. The first is through lockdowns. Of course, at the moment, we're beginning another modified ECQ. So lockdowns imposed either nationally or at local levels to control the spread of the virus. Lockdowns, of course, as we know and as we have experienced, it immediately forces workers, regardless of sector of employment, and excluding only those classified as essential workers, from either working. So they force workers to either work from home or not work at all during the extent of the lockdown. But of course, we know that some work cannot actually be done from home. The second is through the social or physical distancing required even after a lockdown has ended or even in the absence of a lockdown policy. So for as long as no vaccine is developed. Included here are travel restrictions to prevent infections coming from abroad. This affects work that is contact intensive or that requires people to congregate in a closed or relatively small area. This includes jobs in restaurants, shopping centers, airlines, and cruise ships, public transportation, sports and concert arenas, spas, barbershops, and beauty salons, among others. The third is via the reduction in aggregate demand due to reduced purchasing power within country and abroad. Because domestic income will decline as people lose jobs, meaning people will earn less or nothing in the Philippines will also spend less. But also because of lower remittances from abroad, as many OFWs are displaced. So there will be less remittances for domestic consumption. As the remittances declined by more than 6% compared to April last year. And a declining remittances is expected for the rest of the year. And also because of lower foreign income, which means lower demand for Philippine exports. So this will all impact household income. What has actually happened to employment in the Philippines? So far, what we have is information from the April 2020 labor force survey. So this was during the height of the Luzon lockdown. So this is probably the employment picture at its worst. Of people who were employed or had jobs in 2019. So the number of employed went down by 5 million in the services sector and more than 2 million in the industry sector. There was in comparison only a relatively small decline in agricultural employment. Considering that every year the number of employed usually goes up by more than 1 million, then that's another million potential jobs that were also lost. By subsector, there were large job losses in construction. That's more than 2.4 million jobs lost. Wholesale and retail trade, more than 2 million jobs lost. Accommodation and food service activities and other service activities. Other service activities include laundry, barbers, beauty shops, computer repairs. But there's more. Among the employed, there are also those who reported they had a job, but in fact did no work and likely earned no income. Such would be the case for those referred to as non-regular employees, who were paid either per day or per hour or per piece of output or on a pakyawan or on commission basis, which are the great majority of employees. They comprise more than, or they make up more than 60% of employees. So there were an estimated 12.5 million workers who reported having a job but not having done any work due to the lockdown or COVID-19. Assuming conservatively that only half of them did not receive any income, because of course not all companies can afford to pay per day workers when they're not actually producing any output, then that is equivalent to about 6 million workers severely affected by COVID-19 and the lockdown. And in fact, there's more. One also has to include farmers and fishermen who might have worked but were not able to sell their produce or catch because they could not transport them during the lockdown, and also overseas Filipino workers who lost their jobs, some of whom have already returned to the country. According to POAA, Philippine Overseas Employment Administration displaced as of July. I think more recent estimates puts it at more than 200,000 already. And of this displaced, about 50,000 have already returned to the Philippines, have been repatriated. There are good reasons to think that these job losses have had a big impact on poverty, or will have a big impact on poverty. One of those is that the job losses appears to have disproportionately affected those with lower education. So there was more than a 300% increase in the number of unemployed who only had elementary education or less. There was more than a 250% increase in the number of unemployed who only had junior high school education or less. The increase in unemployment among those with higher education were also high, but lower in comparison. So there are many ways in which poverty can be measured, although poverty is what I will focus on in this presentation. There's also, of course, self-rated poverty, as reported on a quarterly basis by the social weather stations. Then there is multidimensional poverty, usually a composite of education, health, and income measures. And then income poverty, which is based on a comparison of income, of household per capita income against a poverty line or threshold. But then you can also have different $2 a day poverty line used by the World Bank for inter-country comparisons. But here we use official poverty lines or thresholds. So the poverty line by definition is the amount computed by our government statisticians to be just sufficient to meet the most basic food and non-food needs. The Philippine Statistics Authority has a different poverty line for each province. Let me also note that in the succeeding simulations, we also measure poverty at the level of households rather than individuals. The only major difference is that poverty will be higher when measured at the level of individuals compared to households, since poor households usually have more members, but otherwise the patterns will be similar. So these are the measures of poverty we will be using. So first is poverty incidence, also known as headcount ratio. It is just the percentage of households with per capita income below the poverty line. We will also use the poverty gap index, which is a measure of the shortfall of the total population from the poverty line. There is a related measure that we will also use, index for the poor, which is the average shortfall of the poor from the poverty line. So it's the poor only, looking at the poor only. And finally, poverty severity, or the squared poverty gap, which is a measure of the inequality among the poor. So in our simulations, we use Monte Carlo simulations using national representative household and in. So we use information from the April 2020 labor force survey on the characteristics of those who lost jobs. So this, the Monte Carlo simulations tries to address the lack of exact knowledge as to which individuals will lose their jobs by making it probabilistic, but doing it repeatedly. So in particular, we will use the linked family income and expenditure survey and labor force survey. So meaning they are the same household, the same individuals. So poverty statistics are based on the PAASE, which only comes out every 3 years. The most recent one is 2018. The next one is for 2021, which will only come out possibly in early 2023. But for this exercise, but we calibrate it to the 2018 income distribution because we need a PAASE that can be linked to the labor force survey, and the 2018 PAASE LFS link file is not yet available. So this is what we do. So we assume that individuals who earn wages or entrepreneurial income earn this at a uniform rate over the course of the year, and that the effects of the ECQ and COVID-19 are implemented in the form of job loss among workers using the information from the ELV. We do a random assignment of who among workers by level of education lose their jobs due to the ECQ and COVID-19. And then we take into account the more than 2 months of full lockdown that actually happened. So job loss is not assumed to disappear just because the lockdown is ended. But after the full lockdown, we assume there's a linear recovery in employment until job loss is reduced to 1/3 of its full lockdown level by the end of the year. So gradual decline in job loss. So over the course of the year, people recovered jobs, but not to the full extent. Only 2/3 of those who lose their jobs recover them by the end of the year. So again, we do random assignment of who among the workers by education level lose jobs due to the ECQ using Monte Carlo simulations. Then we average the results for 30 simulations. We've actually also done it for 100, but there's really very little difference. So to save time, we just did it for 30 simulations. Then these are the results. So these simulations assume the absence of any transfers, whether from government or a private source, but also implicitly assumes that households can tap into their savings or borrow from some source, either other households or some financial institutions, so that they are able to spread out their consumption over the course of the year. So this figure shows the results for poverty incidence. So without transfers from government or other sources, poverty incidence can rise from the baseline level of 14%, that's without COVID-19, to about 21%, equivalent to about 2 million more poor households, about 10 million poor individuals. So this is a 50% increase in poverty incidence. The effect on poverty gap expected to almost double, indicating that the population on average is farther from the poverty line. In fact, if you look at the poverty gap only among the poor, what you see is that the poverty gap among the poor increases from about 22% to 27%. So meaning that without COVID-19, the poor will be about, the per capita incomes of the poor will be about 22% away from the poverty line. After COVID-19, they will be 27% away from the poverty line. So if you combine this with the information from the previous slide, so this means that not only will there be more poor, but on average, they will be farther from the poverty line. Next is poverty severity. So the estimated increase in poverty severity is also very high. So that's more than double, which means that there will also be more inequality among the poor, or more extreme poverty. So next, what we did was we ran further simulations. An obvious one, of course, will be in the Bayanihan, there was a 2-month cash grant given to about 18 million low-income households. What will be the effect of that on poverty? So, assuming perfect targeting, meaning that all the social amelioration program funds go to the poorest 18 million households, and that there's no corruption, the result is this on poverty incidence. So poverty incidence will be 18% rather than 21%. So it will mitigate the effect on poverty, but not fully offset the effect of COVID-19 and the ECQ. So this is true regardless of which measure of income poverty you look at, whether it is poverty gap, so lower poverty gap, but still higher than baseline, poverty gap among the poor, and poverty severity. Of course, there were also other help that was available from the private sector and also from LGUs, not just the Bayanihan cash grant. So overall, there's probably more mitigation. But I still think not enough to fully offset the impact of COVID-19, as these other interventions are smaller in scale. Also, of course, we know that there was probably some corruption in the distribution of the funds, and also there was a long delay. In fact, some households report not having received any at all, even though they were likely very low income households. So we also simulate the effect of the impact of possible increases in prices, in particular food prices. So this relates to the earlier presentation of Dr. Tarete. So we simulate the effect of a rise in food inflation, just to highlight how important it is to make sure that the supply chain works. So we simulated the effect of a 5%, 10%, and 15% rise in food inflation above the normal. So normally, food prices increase by about only 2% to 2.5% every year. So anything above that we consider as extraordinary rise in food inflation. So what we found was that, well, of course, higher food inflation would result in greater poverty because it will impact the poverty threshold, and that a 15% above normal food inflation would completely offset the effect of the Bayanihan 2-month cash grant. So we have other simulations, but I will not show them anymore. This is just to show that among the poor or poverty severity. So COVID-19 affects not only employment and income, but also other aspects of household welfare. So apart from its effect on income, or directly following its effect on income, COVID-19 can also, for example, affect health and education outcomes. And the effect is likely to be felt even beyond this year. So for example, COVID-19 is likely to reduce access to health services for non-COVID-19 patients, which is likely to lower future health outcomes for many people. And for example, it also has it is expected to have a big effect on education outcomes. For example, we are already seeing that COVID-19 is reducing enrollment at all levels of education. So this combined with the rapid shift to distance learning will likely have long-term consequences and reduce educational outcomes for current students. The reduced enrollment currently being observed, I will show them in the next slide, are likely to stem from the following reasons. So, access to digital technology needed for online learning might be reluctant to send their children to school, instead choosing to wait it out. Also, parents' fear of infection for their children and family, things are uncertain enough that face-to-face classes is still a possibility at least early next year. Finally, lower household incomes are also likely impacting enrollment. If you look at the available data, among the out-of-school youth, majority, the reason they give for not going to school is still economic. Either their household does not have enough income, or they're actually already working. This is because there's actual cost to sending children to school, even if tuition is free. And of course, we also know that there is opportunity cost. Given the current hardships, parents could decide that the chance of getting employment for their family will be higher with more of the household members available for work, including children. So for example, this is based on the DepEd reported data as of end July. So enrollment in K-12 was lower by about 5 million students as of end July. Enrollment level is back to where it was 12 years ago. That's the enrollment level. If you look at the rate, it is set back even further. Of course, there is now a larger student age population. The fall in enrollment is also occurring at all basic education levels. So it appears many parents have decided to delay entry of their children to kindergarten. For this and other students who will be dropping out, it will be more difficult for them to get back to school later. So access is lower, but so will quality most probably, as schools adopt distance learning. Very few households among the lower income groups have ownership of personal computers and broadband access. And although many households own cell phones and could potentially avail of mobile data, the cost is prohibitive for poor households. So for example, in this table, you look at the last column, there's there, in the poorest income decile, 76% of households have either postpaid or prepaid communication expenses. And so the possibility of mobile data access. But actually, if you look at the actual expenditure, 50 pesos. So probably not utilizing mobile data. So to summarize, COVID-19 has had a tremendous negative impact on employment and potentially very large effect on poverty, possibly reversing all the gains in poverty achieved since 2012. Its effect on employment has been highly unequal, disproportionately affecting those with lower education and lower income in the first place. It is setting back enrollment in basic education by more than a decade. The Bayanihan Cash Grant helped, but we know that potentially there was a significant leakage since number of households covered was already more than 70% of all households in the country. Meanwhile, for really poor recipient households, grant was probably inadequate because of fixed amount per household, 5,000 to 8,000, which was only adequate for a family of size 4 in NCR and family of size 3 elsewhere. But in fact, the average size of poor households is about 6. There was, of course, also a delay in distribution of the cash grants, which likely caused a lot of hunger and distress because large number of households are in danger of immediate poverty. They probably do not have savings and have poor access on the report of Dr. Mangahas. So some recommendations, an extension of support to affected low income households, so further buy any hand. But there is a need for timeliness and better targeting of those really in need and making sure there is no duplication, which was a problem with the previous thing, for PAASE to further incentivize parents to keep their children in school. So this can be in the form of increasing the cash incentives to parents or increasing the number of households covered by for PAASE. Also expand access to digital technology to enable the poor to participate in online learning, to avail of health services like telemedicine, avail of government services, and possibly to help them generate opportunities for livelihood. Also, ensure inflation is under control, especially for food, which figures heavily in the consumption basket of the poor. This means ensuring supply chain is working properly and that farmers have the capital to engage in their usual production. I would also recommend employment support programs, including emergency employment and retraining for workers in sectors unlikely to recover soon. And improve social protection programs for the working poor, especially those in self-employment. So I will recommend, for example, a subsidized social security or at least consider this to get a ready safety net during crisis. I will also recommend the establishment of unemployment insurance which is already in place in other ASEAN countries, the Philippines, for example, Lao PDR and Vietnam. And of course, economic recovery will ultimately be necessary. So expansionary fiscal and monetary policies will be important as well. But I think some of this will be discussed by the presenters later. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for that very informative, enlightening discussion. We move on to our fourth presenter. Dr. Mahelaya Viravago is Associate Professor at the Department of Economics at Ateneo de Manila University. Her research interests include energy economics, economics of natural disasters, development economics, and resource economics. She was the program director of the 2014 to 2018 USAID grant, Energy Policy and Development Program, or EPDP. She served as the president of the Philippine Economic Society in 2018. She received the 1 UP Faculty Grant Award in Economics for Outstanding Research and Public Service in UP Diliman. This was in 2016 to 2018, when she was assistant professor at the UP. In 2016, she was awarded the Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology. She earned her BS in Business Economics and MA Economics from the University of the Philippines. She obtained her PhD Economics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa in 2012 under the East-West Center Graduate Degree Fellowship Program. Please welcome with me Dr. Mahelaya Viravago.
Good morning. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thanks to you and Dr. Concepcion for inviting me to be part of this session. So this paper is co-written with Professor James Rumaset from the University of Hawaii. Okay. The Philippines Medium-Term Development Plan for 2017 to 2022 is anchored on Ambition Natin 2040, which targets attaining a high income target for the Philippines in 2040. In fact, the country is poised to meet this target. The Philippine economy is on a high trajectory since the beginning of the current decade. For the period of 2010 to 2019, the average growth was 6.3%, which is the highest 7-year average since the mid-1970s. And concerns about attracting generation investment is what we have before 2020 because electricity consumption was expected to grow to nearly 4 times its 2018 level by 2040. Now, come 2020, enter the COVID-19 pandemic, and the forecast for the Philippines turned sour, falling into negative territory to as low as here 7%. Okay, now, it is commonly believed that because of its low fuel cost, high plant costs, and high ramping inefficiencies, the least cost generation mix involved using coal as the baseload fuel. So we have here on the graph is the load profile for any time of the day, and you have here the base load, which is coal, because it has the comparative advantage in serving the minimum load over a typical 24-hour period, such that it can run at a nearly constant rate at or near maximum capacity. In contrast, you have here the open cycle gas turbine plants because it's low plant cost and greater ramping flexibility. And you have here the CCGT, or the combined cycle gas turbine, because it has a high plant cost and also greater ramping flexibility. Now the question is, how do we determine the least cost mix, or how do we know when CCGT will supplement the baseload coal and when do we use the fast peaking plants OCGT? The economist Josco proposed to use screening curves. Now, what is screening curves? It's a screening curves plot average cost as the linear function of annualized fixed cost plus variable cost per hour times the number of hours used. So this one determines at what load per hour the base load generation begins to be supplemented by the intermediate fuel type, and when those two are further supplemented by the peaking fuel type. So in another paper, I written it here, we did the analysis and apply screening curve for Luzon. So this one. So applying the analysis and projecting the demand up to 2025 and including pollution costs, what we found is that coal is the least cost generating fuel for the low demand hours of 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. So this means that for the other hours, it should be supplemented by intermediate peaker plants, and for the peaker demands of 1 and 2 p.m., it will be supplemented by the fast peaker plants. Note that what is run during the base load can be run all day. Now, during the lockdown, we of course know that demand falls. Now there is excess capacity. The problem becomes choosing which plant to use and which to leave idle. So from the screening analysis, it suggests that coal would be the sole generating source for more hours of the day. Now, in reality, just the opposite happened. So we see here that coal generation fell dramatically from 56% to 48%. Why this paradoxical result? There are two reasons. One is the inflexibilities in legal rules and contracts. RE's renewable energy source are assured mass dispatch status as per the Renewable Energy Law of 2008. Thus, the system operator is required to accept whatever is generated. Second, there's inflexibilities of the supply of gas arriving by pipeline. So we have these take or pay bilateral contracts with Meralco that assure minimum purchases of natural gas generation, which reflect this inflexibility in gas delivery. Now, this leaves the burden of adjustment falling on coal plants, a number of which have had to temporarily shut down production. Now, turning to the effect of lockdown on electricity prices. Okay, so wholesale rates on the spot market fell by 55% during the lockdown period. And then going to the retail rates, specifically for Meralco service area, we actually saw an increase from March to April, but this is really due to the normalization of the universal charge rate. Please also note that in April, ERC suspended the collection of the feed-in tariff allowance in our bill. Then in May and June, we see here a decline in the retail rates for Meralco because they have availed the force majeure provisions in their PSA, thus allowing them to pay a lower fixed charge, which reflected in our bill. Now, given this, we still had the bill shock or the electric shock, right? So what Meralco did is to use the December to February average to bill customers for March and April. In fairness to Meralco, they are just really following what is stated in the distribution code. There's a provision in the distribution code that was issued by the ERC. Now, why the widespread confusion and complaints? I think the shortcoming of Meralco is that while they announced that they're going to use the 3-month average, it was not, I guess, appropriately communicated that when the lockdown is to be lifted, we will be billed, okay, or there will be some adjustment in the actual consumption that we had. Please note that when the lockdown happened, we have also experienced a very high temperature. In fact, international observers are calling it extreme heat wave. So if you look at the electricity consumption last year for 2019, Meralco is averaging December here, January and February of 2019. If you look at the consumption in April and May, our consumption is really much higher. So thus, when the actual electricity consumption was billed to us in May, when the lockdown was lifted, now complaints ensued. Okay, so pursuant to Machiavellian credo of never letting a crisis go to waste, some observers advocate acceleration of the transition away from coal towards renewable. This is actually specified in the RE Law of 2008, wherein it's specified as an aspirational target of 35% renewable by the year 2030. Now, looking at the share of renewables in dependable capacity, it's already at 31%, okay? But the DOE rules specified that the 35% should be attained in terms of generation. So in terms of generation, what we have here is 23.4%, which is somewhat more difficult to attain. Now, given the gap, 35% versus the 23% in the aqua generation, the question is, are subsidies for RE still necessary? So note that the Lazard levelized cost of electricity for wind and solar for the US are already below those of coal and natural gas. The cost of intermittency are quite modest, given the abundant opportunities for diversification, the falling cost of battery storage, and possibilities for demand management. Greater renewable mandates and subsidies could compromise the objectives of affordability, reliability, and security embodied in the EPIRA and also in the Tax Reform Act of 2017. Mandates and subsidies also put RE advocates at loggerheads with the DOE's declared technology neutral policy. So given that the solar is so cheap and its intermittency manageable, the question is, why is adoption so slow in the Philippines? The feed-in tariff subsidies are actually retarding the transition. Now, pitting consumer welfare against the environment is a false dichotomy. Consumer welfare is maximized by the least cost generation mix after including the social cost of pollution. Given the rapid reduction in solar costs, diversification possibilities, demand management, and cheaper storage, the transition towards renewable is coming. We are not denying that. The role of government is to facilitate an efficient energy transition and not to force it prematurely with costly subsidies. Now, one might ask, what do we mean by this efficient energy transition? Okay, by efficient, we mean the least social cost. So the efficient energy transition should take into account the falling cost of wind and solar, and the low cost of managing intermittency. Taxes should reflect the marginal damage cost of pollution, especially from generation with coal. The coal and petroleum excise taxes are part of the 2017 tax reform. So this is already a step towards the right direction. Pollution taxes can harmonize the quest for renewability with affordability and other objectives of EFIRA. So it's just really leveling the playing field. The social cost of pollution, which is included here when we determine the least social cost, this includes both domestic costs from carbon emissions and the cost of local pollutants that impinge on health. The local pollutants include the sulfur oxide, nitrous oxides, and particulate matter. These local pollutants are actually far more costly. The damage cost add-on for natural gas is very small compared to coal. Existing subsidies should be phased out in accordance with competitive cost wind and solar power. Other policies can complement the ability of the market system to deliver energy efficiently. One would be safeguarding competition by free entry and generation and into generation and retailing. Another is the planning of investment in transmission in accordance with generation investments that minimize social costs and not according to investors' demand, as what happened in Negros. Aligning retail rates more closely with marginal costs, including real-time pricing, can lower the cost on intermittency, lower rates, and deliver greater benefits from the power system. Some concluding remarks. Given that utility-scale wind and solar projects are cost competitive with coal and natural gas, probably or perhaps an investigation is needed into the relatively small investments into those sources. It is likely that bureaucratic requirements of FIT subsidies are actually retarding investment relative to free market levels. Existing coal plants and some new LNG plants can be part of an efficient transition towards renewable. And as a final remark, using COVID-19 to justify further subsidies is likely to be counterproductive. So we did this commentary and it's published in the East Asia Forum magazine, and an elaboration of this commentary is released as a working paper at the Ateneo. This is posted at the Ateneo de Manila Department of Economics website. And as forgive me for the shameless advertisement, our book is still available at the UP Press online store. Monching, Jeff, and Sarah have all their respective chapters in this book. So thank you very much. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Maha. Yes, I'll be presenting next. Now I have, for the first time, I've pre-recorded my presentation.
Before you present, Sarah, let me say something about you, if I may. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Sarah Lynn Salvador Daway Ducanes, who is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics, from which she also obtained her bachelor's in economics degree, summa cum laude, in 2003, and a master's economics degree in 2005. She earned her PhD economics from the University of California, Riverside in 2012. Until recently, she held the position of UP School of Economics Research Director and was an executive editor of the Journal of Asian Economics. She is currently a board member of the Philippine Economic Society. Her research interests include macroeconomic theory, monetary theory, and policy and related topics in development economics. Dr. Daway Ducanes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Gisela, for that generous introduction. So as I said earlier, I've pre-recorded my presentation. Thank you. Good morning again to everyone. This is a short presentation on COVID-19 and the external threats posed by its effects on the Philippine economy. I focus on two external threats, namely the threat to remittances and to tourism. The outline of the presentation is as follows. We first look at the contribution of remittances and tourism to the Philippine economy. We then focus on remittances and tourism in 2019, and then lay out the outlook on these sectors for 2020. Using an input-output framework, we then present the simulated output and employment effects of decreased remittances and tourism due to COVID-19. And finally, we briefly discuss some policy implications. Tourism and remittances are both important to the Philippine economy, each making up a substantial portion of GDP. In 2019, tourism direct gross value added was at around 2.5 trillion pesos, making up about 12.7% of GDP. Inbound, or foreign tourism expenditures, were at 549 billion pesos. This is about 15% of total tourism expenditures in the country, while domestic tourism expenditures, that is, tourism expenditures made by residents, were at about 3.14 trillion pesos, which is about 85% of total tourism expenditures. The tourism sector employed around 5.71 million workers, making up about 13.5% of total employment in 2019. In the same year, remittances were at 1.70 trillion pesos, making up around 8.7% of GDP. Cash remittances, which are remittances coursed through banks and other formal financial institutions, were at 1.53 trillion pesos, or 7.8% of GDP. Now, in times past, remittances have been observed to act as buffers against economic downturns. Relatives residing and working abroad tend to remit money to relatives in need during difficult times, thereby promoting consumption stability amongst remittance-receiving households in the Philippines. In the couple of years leading to the pandemic, remittances have been purported to fund investments in real estate, housing, and spending on consumer durables. As mentioned earlier, cash remittances reached around $30 billion, equivalent to 1.53 trillion pesos. Now, cash remittances are remittances that are coursed through banks and other formal financial institutions, that is, remittance centers like LBC Pera Padala, pawn shops, etc. Land-based sources accounted for 78% of total remittances, whereas sea-based sources, primarily from incomes remitted by Filipino seafarers, accounted for 22% of cash remittances. In 2019, 42% of cash remittances, or 643 billion pesos, came from the Americas, around 90% of which came from the US, 22% from Asia, 20% from the Middle East, 13% from Europe, 3% from Oceania, and 0.01% from Africa. The pie chart here shows the expenditures of a remittance-receiving household. This is based on the 2015 Family Income and Expenditure Survey. Food and beverages had the largest share, at 29% of total expenditures, followed by housing, rent, and utilities, 25%, miscellaneous goods and services and other disbursements, 20%. Now notice that education made up only about 4.4%, while health made up only 3% of total expenditures. Transport expenditures made up an even larger share of 4.9%, while recreation, culture, accommodation, special family occasion was at 3.2% and higher than health expenditures. The The pie chart here shows the profile of inbound tourism expenditures. Using 2018 expenditure shares, accommodation services for visitors had the largest share at around 25%. This is followed by food and beverage serving services at 24%, then by transport services at 23%, entertainment and recreation services 14%, shopping 11%, miscellaneous goods and services 2%, and the spending on travel agencies and other reservation services at 1%. We now discuss the outlook for remittances and tourism in 2020 in the face of the COVID-19 generated crisis. The table here shows the top 10 remittance sources in 2019. Together, these 10 countries were the source of 1.20 trillion pesos, or 78% of total cash remittances. 574 billion pesos, or 35%, came from the US, followed by 7% from Saudi Arabia, 6% each from Singapore and Japan, 5% each from the UAE and the UK, and 3% each from Canada, Hong Kong, Germany, and Kuwait. However, due to COVID-19, these countries are themselves facing dismal economic growth prospects. The Q1 year-on-year growth rate of US GDP was at -5%, -1% for Saudi Arabia, negative for the rest of the other top remittance sources. The IMF Gdp Growth Outlook for 2020 for these countries is also dire, ranging from -1.1% to -7%. The US, our biggest remittance source, is expected to suffer a -5.9% decline in GDP growth for the entire year. Indeed, before the pandemic, in January and February 2020, remittances rose 6.6% and 2.5% year-on-year, respectively. In March, remittances were down by 4.7%, rounding up the year-on-year Q1 growth of remittances to just about 1.5%, compared to the 4.1% Q1 growth of remittances in 2019. In April, remittances dropped further from $2.44 billion to $2.05 billion, a 16.2% year-on-year decline. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or the BSP, forecasts a 5% drop in remittances, equivalent to around 0.4% of GDP. Now, JICA, or the Japan International Cooperation Agency, forecasts quite a large drop of around 33%, while the Department of Labor and Employment's forecast is not far behind at around 40%. Thus, remittances are expected to decline somewhere between 5 to 40%, which is quite a wide range. To make some sense of these estimates, let's do some back-of-the-envelope computations. In 2019, OFW remittances for 6 months, from April to September, were at 212 billion pesos. Now, assuming that OFW remittances for the entire year is just double this, that would give us about 424 billion pesos for the entire year. As of today, there are about 500,000 OFWs that have lost their jobs due to COVID-19. They make up about 23% of the 2.2 million OFWs estimated by the Philippine Statistics Authority. Thus, expected OFW remittance losses for 2020 are about 3/4 or 424 billion pesos times 23%, which gives us about 72 billion pesos, making up about 4.73% of 2019 remittances. However, these are only remittances from OFWs. Around 72% of remittances are transfers made by non-residents, mainly Filipinos who have become residents of the countries where they are now working at, to Filipino households. given the World Bank's forecast of a global decline of around 5.2%, this brings the expected remittance losses from other sources by about 57 billion pesos, around 3.76% of 2019 remittances. So adding up 3.76% and 4.73% gives us around 8.5%. This is the expected decline in remittances, OFW remittances, and remittances from other sources in 2020. Alternatively, we can have the following computations. In quarter one, remittances grew by about 1.5%. Now, in April, remittances declined by 16.18%. Now, suppose that the May and June growth rates are the same as in April, so that's 16.8 to 18% decline, and 10% for the rest of the year. So doing the computations, we arrive at negative 8.68% decline in remittances for 2020, or that's around 9% decline in remittances for the entire year. Now we go to the tourism outlook for 2020. Tourist arrivals all over the world dropped by as much as 57% in March, according to the UNWTO, or UN World Tourism Organization, now as many economies started imposing lockdown measures. International tourism is expected to decline all over the world for the entire year by about 58 to 78%. Now in the Philippines, international tourist arrivals already declined by 54% from January to April 2020. And tourism revenues decreased by 55% for the same period, according to DOT Secretary Puyat. The Philippine Tourism Survey reports that 80% of tourism operators expect losses of over 50% of 2020 revenues. Using a diagram, we now lay out the input-output framework which we used to come up with our simulation results. Due to COVID-19, global demand declines, which results in lower remittances and international tourism. The decline in remittances reduces aggregate consumption and investment, while the decline in international tourism reduces exports. In turn, the decline in aggregate demand reduces the final demand for the sectoral outputs, that is, outputs of agriculture, industry, and the services sectors. Decreased demand for the outputs of these sectors, in turn, reduce the demand for the intermediate inputs used in these sectors. Now, these result in a decline in aggregate supply, which reduces the demand for factors of production, namely land, labor, capital, which in turn has adverse effects on incomes and employment in these sectors, and the overall adverse implications for growth, poverty, and inequality. So we look at the following scenarios. For remittances, we look at the effects of a 5%, 9%, and 40% decline in cash remittances. Whereas for tourism, we look at a 58% and 78% decline in inbound tourism. This is in accordance with the forecasts made by the UNWTO. Now we look at the simulated output and employment effects of decreased remittances. A 5% decline in remittances results in a 76 billion peso decline in gross value added, equivalent to about 0.39% of GDP. This is the same as, or almost the same as, the BSP's forecast. And a potential employment decline of around 140,000 jobs, equivalent to 0.34% of 2019 total employment. Now, a 9% decline in remittances results in a 0.70% decline in GDP. That's about 137 billion pesos. And a 0.60% decline in total employment. This is around 603,000 jobs. A 40% decline in remittances would result in a 3.13% decline in GDP, equivalent to about 610 billion pesos, and a 2.68% decline in total employment, which is equivalent to about 1.12 million jobs. This table here shows the 10 most affected subsectors from decreased remittances. The total gross value-added losses in these sectors account for about 0.30% to 2.38% of GDP. The most heavily affected sectors are wholesale and retail, which is the hardest hit by far. These are the malls, grocery stores, etc. Ownership of dwellings and real estate activities. Primarily condominiums, which according to anecdotes were funded heavily by OFW remittances. Electricity, education, accommodation and food service activities. These are mainly hotels, restaurants, resorts, land transport, food manufacturing, furniture and fixtures, and communication. Communication, we have mobile and internet usage. Moving on to the sign-related output and employment effects of decreased inbound tourism, a 58% to 78% decline in inbound tourism results in a 318 to 428 billion peso decrease in gross value added, equivalent to 1.63 to 2.19% decline in GDP. The potential employment losses range from about 916,000 to 1.23 million jobs, equivalent to 2.20 to 2.96% of total employment. As in the case of decreased remittances, the services sector is and by far the most heavily affected sector. The gross value-added losses of the 10 most heavily affected sectors range from about 1.19% to 1.60% of GDP. Again, the most heavily affected sector is wholesale and retail, but this is followed closely by accommodation and food service activities, then by arts, entertainment and recreation, food manufacturers, air transport, non-bank financial intermediation, electricity, other mining and quarrying, land transport, and petroleum and other fuel products. The potential employment losses in these 10 sectors range from about 670,000 to 900,000 jobs. So the range is about 1.61% to 2.17% of total employment. In both cases, in the case of decreased remittances and decreased tourism, 6 to 7 out of the 10 hardest hit subsectors belong to the services sector, while the rest are industry subsectors. Now on to some policy implications. Counter the decline in demand due to decreased remittances and tourism by boosting consumer and investor confidence by first proactively dealing with the public health sector crisis. One way of concretely doing this is by fast-tracking investments on telemedicine, which can help unburden our healthcare facilities. Another is to prioritize help to micro, medium, and small enterprises or MSMEs. In all simulations, wholesale and retail, accommodation and food service activities emerged in the top 10 most heavily affected sectors, while some subsectors are under manufacturing. Now, according to the PSA's 2018 list of establishments, 46% of MSME establishments are under wholesale and retail, 14.5% in accommodation and food service activities, and 12% in manufacturing. These three alone employ about 3.61 million workers, equivalent to almost 9% of total employment. Help then can be in the form of loans and other liquidity support measures to address their cash flow problems, to preserve jobs, ensure business continuity, and build capacity for strengthening resilience to adverse shocks. Another policy implication involves preparing comprehensive, well-coordinated, and clearly communicated tourism recovery plans, beginning with domestic tourism. Recovery will have to start by encouraging domestic tourism with strictly implemented health protocols. And it has to start, with domestic tourism as one. This has the lion's share of tourism expenditures, around 85%. And number two, restoring inbound tourism confidence will also depend on how well domestic tourism is handled. Last is build resilience through increased digitization and production flexibility. Building resilience involves making investments not only on physical capital, for example, roads, bridges, machinery and equipment, etc., but also on human capital, that is education and health, and on improving technology, especially information and communication technology. The current pandemic has brought to light the importance of digitization, especially in facilitating contactless transactions and social distancing. Sectors and firms that are able to more flexibly transform their operations and leapfrog faster onto digital or online platforms stand to lose less and gain more quickly during and in the aftermath of the pandemic. In this further connection, public-private investments are key to fast-tracking improvements in digital technology and infrastructure, which would potentially generate gains that will outlast the effects of this current global pandemic. This ends my presentation. Thank you, and the floor is now open for your questions. Okay, thank you. Now we open the floor to your questions. Okay. Okay, so this is a question from Dr. Mangajas addressed to yours truly. Have you estimated the effect of the transport lockdown on the various sectors? So, not yet, sir, although we've come up with, well, I have the estimates like for the entire economy, that takes into account the effects of the decline in final demand for the different subsectors. So that includes, for the transport sector, but then the simulation is for the entire economy. And I am just not at liberty yet to, to divulge.
Your model does not include the linkage from transportation to all of those things. You see, it's as though you can proceed to those sectors without taking care of the transportation needs of the workers and of the people who are going to be making use of those sectors. To me, that's the most important.
Actually,
the input-output, most important link is to have the transportation so that the workers of those sectors can go to work, and then the people who are buying the products of those services can go there and also make use of them, because this is not going to be all virtual, virtual
actually,
work.
sir, when we did the simulation, so we made assumptions regarding the decline in expenditure for transport services, for land, for airport, according to the shares of transport expenditures that say OFW households or households with OFWs, or tourists, spend on these sectors. So those are already implicitly included in the simulation.
More basic yet, Sarah. The ability of the workers to take transportation to go to work in those sectors, and the ability of the demanders to take transportation to go to make use of those particular sectors. Ordinary jeepneys, for example. I think the jeepney transport sector is completely, out of the model, as though people are thinking it's there, but that's the most important missing link in letting, in improving the economy.
I agree, sir. Although we've just focused, as I said, in the simulations, we just focused on the effects of decline in remittances on the spending patterns of households that are receiving these remittances, and also of those sectors, the decline in the demand for the sectors that are directly involved in the tourism sectors. So those also include, a certain extent, land, air, water transport services.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I have a question for Maha. Maha, I thought I heard you that the intermittency problem of REs, I mean, these are the REs like solar and wind, not the hydro, is alleviated. Can you please explain that? Is there a new technology now that they would really have batteries or access to batteries so that they can become mainstay for our energy power?
The intermittency cost. So one solution to the intermittency cost is the battery storage, right?
Yes.
Although the development of the battery, the technological development of battery is not as fast as we all know relative to the development of solar panels. But that's not the only solution to intermittency. There are other solutions like that, diversification. Like in the US, we have the hydro to cover for the intermittency problem, and there's also the technology with regards to the projecting the demand in terms of the system being used in the wholesale electric in the systems operator. So that's also part of managing the intermittency. So all those combined, uses of managing the intermittency shows that it's already falling in the US. So the question now is, given that we are seeing those falling costs for intermittency and that the technology for battery storage is up and coming, why do we have slower investments in the Philippines for those REs?
Later.
Yes, Dr. Pernia.
Sports car.
You have a question? Yes, please, Dr. Pernia.
Yes, again, a couple of quick questions. Just to segue from Monching Clarete's question on Maha. You mentioned a conundrum. You said that despite the FIT being applied to renewables, there's still the investment in renewables is still very shy, or they're still staying away from renewables. Is it because the FIT is a signal that that the cost of renewables are going to be unstable or unpredictable, and that is what is keeping away investors in renewables? And then just a very quick question also to Sarah and Jeff. I'm sure you have seen the data comparing the expenditures or spending on COVID-19 related issues across ASEAN countries, and the Philippines is really badly lagging behind. For example, we are only spending as a percentage to GDP, we're only spending 5.7%, whereas Vietnam is spending 10% of GDP, Thailand 16%, Malaysia 22%, and Indonesia 6%. So I think it would be useful, and on per capita basis also very low. We're only spending $197 dollars per person, whereas Vietnam is spending $277 per person. In Thailand is $1,211 per person, and so on. Anyway, I think that the problem is we are not spending enough on COVID, with respect to the health aspect as well as to the economy, and therefore, perhaps by getting a ballpark figure in terms of how much it would cost, what you have recommended, what Jeff has recommended in terms of social safety net and additional spending on also employment insurance and so on. And then Sarah's recommendation, Dr. Sarah's recommendations on how to boost tourism and especially tourism and also the remittances. How much would that be in terms of additional spending by the government, so that at least we can, signal to the government that we should really spend more rather than less on this COVID related issues. Thank you. Maha, thank you for.
Yes, thank you, Sec Ernie, for the question. Actually, what we are saying is that FIT is actually very costly. It's a subsidy, and we are the ones paying it. So in the bill that we have, it's the FIT all allowance. So that's the one that we are paying. So it's very costly. And in another paper, we have simulated the cost, the welfare cost of FIT. What we're saying is that the cost of renewables, the technology, is already declining. So it's probably, I still don't have the study to back this up, but it's likely that the bureaucratic hurdles is the one that's impeding the investments of this renewable in the Philippines. In the beginning, most countries really did use FIT. But like again, there's a lot of studies in the US that have already demonstrated the welfare cost of using these subsidies. And even in ASEAN, there's a recent paper, I think by Lantau Group, that's saying that Asian countries are now moving away from these subsidies, because the technology is really now, the cost of this technology is really now going down. The battery, the development of the technology for battery is also going down. So all these things about managing the cost of intermittency is also declining. So we should hopefully be seeing more of solar and wind into the grid. And recently, there's already news about solar generation being offered outside of FIT. So because it's becoming now competitive.
But isn't FIT supposed to be an incentive for investors to come in and invest in renewables?
Yes,
that's the
but it's
idea, right? Yeah.
But it's a very costly subsidy. So rather than subsidizing, because it's now becoming cheaper now, the technology.
Costly to the government. It's costly to the government, but beneficial.
We're the one paying for
to the customer. Yeah.
Yeah, we're the one paying for the subsidy. In the
it's going to be. It should attract investors. I thought that was the idea.
Yeah. But there's a particular amount where they can be subscribed to. So now for solar, the subscription has already been filled, and advocates are advocating for a higher subscription. But there's also supplier who already offering generation that is outside FIT, meaning they can already compete. So it's becoming now cost competitive.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ma. So any ballpark figure estimate, Jeff, in terms of what would be the cost to the government if we do all those things that you have recommended, like employment insurance and additional subsidies, social safety nets, and all that?
Okay, sir, thank you for the question. So I don't have any ballpark figure yet. We're in the process of computing them. But I'll just note that I agree with the sentiment you expressed earlier that we're probably under investing at the moment in terms of social protection. We are in extraordinary times. I think the old yardsticks as to what are acceptable in terms of deficit to GDP ratio or even debt to GDP ratio, I think we should move away from them. Of course, we should not completely abandon prudence, but I don't think we should be afraid to incur a larger deficit or a larger debt if the goal is to actually help those who are in great distress. Because what is the government for if not to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected? So I don't have any ballpark figure yet, but for sure it is much more than what was allocated for in Bayanihan 1 in terms of the social protection component of it.
Yeah, it's rather ironic because we have, I think, among the best credit rating among ASEAN countries, and yet we're not taking advantage of that. We are rather protecting it rather than being afraid of spending more, so borrowing more, and therefore risking the downgrade. So that I think that is the thing now. That I think is not the correct direction or vision on the part of the government. Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you, Sec Manager, for those questions. Well, as Jack said, we still don't have an overall estimate right now. But the official estimates for the decline in GDP for the entire year is now between -3% to -4%. And we've only, I think, spent or only about 200 billion pesos were disbursed of the 390 from the Bayanihan 1 Act. No, so that's definitely very, very small. If we're going to plug in the whole 3 to 4%, would need about 800 billion to about 1 trillion pesos, depending on the fiscal multiplier. Now, the fiscal multiplier, well, we don't have an exact estimate, but my sense is that during recessions, the fiscal multiplier tends to be lower, even as people hold off their spending decisions, both consumers and investors. So definitely, you're right. What's been allocated so far is, I think, not enough, even 1.3 trillion, because that might just plug in like a whole of about -5%, -6% growth. But with what's happening right now, my sense is that the GDP growth prospects for the entire year might even be more dire.
Thank you, Professor Sarah.
Could I just comment on this COVID? And it's more about, I think, if COVID is teaching us something, it's really shifting from in-person to online, all this physical distribution to logistics to using online commerce. So the most important part of investment that we really have to consider is making that internet infrastructure really fast, because that is, I think, holding us down in taking advantage of new ways of distributing goods. And even our traditional farming, I mean, you can develop a supply chain that is basically dependent on our using information technology, ICT. But then if they don't have access there in the farm, at the farm, in the rural areas for internet, that will really delay us. So I think if we are thinking about making more investments for recovering from COVID, or leaping to into newer, better future, I think the government should really make our internet infrastructure a lot better.
Agree. That's right.
We agree. And is Dr. Balisacan still here? Because I think that has implications for probably for bringing in a third telco even more to spur competition in the industry.
Second the motion, Mon.
Sorry, Sarah, are you asking me a question or? Sorry, I
Yes, because Sir Munching was talking about revamping up our internet facilities, internet connection, and I think that's pretty much connected, very well connected to the issue of having a third or even more telcos.
that's correct.
No, sir, I think we lost Dr. Balisacan. No, sir.
I think this proves the point, ma'am. Naghang po si sir.
Sayang. Okay, we'll go back to Dr. Balisacan. No, once just case in point, no, like how important good internet connections are, and if they go bust, then yeah, meetings such as this are. Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Ma'am Giselle has a question po.
Yes, Sarah, I just wanted to ask you this question. I noted in your slide on OFWs that, and you highlighted it, a very small percentage that's invested, their remittances to education. And yet we know that we have to think of the long-term benefits of these remittances on our GDP and on the economy. So are there measures you could think of to divert or to increase the investment, I mean, in a strategic or targeted way, of these remitters to the education of their families and their communities? Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. I think Jeff would be in a better position to answer that.
Okay, sorry, I only heard the question very vaguely.
So,
It's about the how to ensure that, or how to try to make remittances be more beneficial in terms of being used more for education. Well, actually, although if you actually look at the household data, what you find when you examine it is that households with OFWs controlling for income and other household characteristics, they actually spend more on education than non-OFW households. So even if they have the same income, so they are more likely, for example, to send their children to college, to a private college at that, compared to a similar non-OFW household. But as a percent of total spending, I guess it is still small. That's partly because for many OFWs and a big portion of the OFW households are in the top income groups, like 60% of them belong to the top 40% of households. A lot of them, the bank or their money is invested in real estate. So if their money is invested in a bank, for example, or saved in a bank, even though they themselves are not investing, they are making the money available for investors to borrow. So I think, in fact, that one of the reasons why interest rates have been quite low for a time, one factor that has contributed to that is this large inflow of remittances that go into the banking system. I think we have to sort of also move away from the old model where you expect the OFWs to themselves be the entrepreneurs. Some of them can do that, but some of them cannot do that. For those who cannot do that, maybe it's enough that they save money, make sure that they earn enough in terms of return on investment, but they don't have to make the investment themselves. But make sure that the money is available for others to use in investment.
Yeah, so follow-up comment from me. So looks like if they invest in the bank, right, those investments could support MSMEs, right? But the other major we call funnel for all those remittances earned would be the condos, the real estate, and that again is something that does not have the inclusivity of the effect of inclusive growth and development. And so the savings, the remittances of the OFWs, they're just caught into the coffers of the top wealthiest in the country. So this has always been our concern, that there might be a way for the government to influence by incentives the way our OFWs invest their money.
Okay, so I agree, ma'am, that it's probably true that too much of the remittances go to the purchase of condominium units, for example. So you have a lot of condominium units that are actually not occupied, whether you're looking at condominiums in Metro Manila or Tagaytay, for example. And in fact, that's the one reason why we expect the construction and real estate to probably go down some more this year and probably next because of the decline in remittances. I think addressing that, I think the problem is the environment for entrepreneurship, the environment for investment. I think that's the one that government has to address. Maybe other people will have something to say on this also, like Dr. Bolongaita, for example. So people put their money into condominiums because it's difficult for them to find an alternative that is guaranteed to generate a good return, while at the same time putting not too much risk on them. And addressing that problem requires generating or establishing a good environment for entrepreneurship, which means that you must have a strong rule of law in place. The time it takes for people to establish a business should be relatively quick, and so on.
Yeah, it's what we wish it was a virtuous cycle, Sec Ernie, but it's a vicious cycle. And it boils down to, the need for more S&T education that would create a more or higher value among our MSMEs, and make our GDP growth more inclusive. If I think I get it right, because a lot of the GDP is reflective of what's growth and development of still the wealthy sector of our population. So I think that there might be ways to support STI ecosystems that would then be established in the regions of the country. And I really think that OFWs might have an important role in supporting us sustaining this. In another session of this conference, we had a model of a very successful farm, Costales Farm in Laguna, that is supported by OFWs. So that's one way of doing it. But the other way is, as I've always suggested, to try to incentivize X% of our OFWs to come home to their regions and establish MSEs, even if you say that they're not entrepreneurs, but they've learned how to do things properly in the medical sector, the health sector, the hotel or tourism sector, and other business sectors in the advanced countries where they're working. So, you know, if we had this kind of competent and skilled human capital back in their regions, there might be a way to jumpstart or to seed these higher value MSMEs in these regions.
Agree, ma'am. There's a question on the chat board. This is addressed to Jeff. How can we increase private or venture capital investment in technology and R&D? Does this involve matching funds from government?
Sorry, I had the problem unmuting myself. I think especially now, Dr. Serafika, I think especially now that will be an important aspect of increasing private capital investment. Because of course now, the animal spirits or the enthusiasm of people for consumption is very low. At the same time, the importance of investment in technology has never been more important. I think now there's a great pressure for countries, for example, to try to accelerate their moves towards Industry 4.0. But how will they do that if there is no clear returns? There are no clear returns in the near future. So I think there's an important role for government to support such investments by, for example, providing matching funds to reduce the risks for those who would want to invest in technology that will actually be productive for the country over the longer term.
Just to add to that, Jeff, I think the question brings to mind the example in Israel, no? Where, as you know, it is probably one of the most successful countries with respect to commercialization, and the startup culture there is something that has been embraced by Silicon Valley itself. No? So there, in terms of the density of startups in Israel, since they have the explanation for that, so to speak, has been in great part due to the role of government, but in its involvement in partnership with private capital. However, one of the interesting things about that is that in Israel, government investments, they've been willing to take a loss, no? and even not entering the space without really seeking to generate a profit, no? in the sense that they even were willing to take a backseat to the private investors. So to letting the private sector really be even more incentivized. So I think that explains in part, how government was able to attract, private capital. The role of the university sector, of course, as Professor Concepcion mentioned, referred to, cannot be, I think, understated. And again, you will see that in Israel's experience, and of course in the U.S. as well. There are important, elements for incentivizing, faculty and students to be entrepreneurial. And it doesn't mean that if a country is wealthy, they can have a very successful commercialization culture in universities. Australia invests a lot in research, but is at the last of the OECD rankings. We are not very good at commercializing, publicly funded research, unlike compared to in the U.S., for example. And part of this is the fact that in Australia the government's investment in research, they seek to get a big cut from inventors' products. So you've got for example, in Australia the federal government will take a third, the state a third, and then a third will go to the inventor, for commercially funded research. In Carnegie Mellon and other universities, it's the 5% rule. Universities only take 5%, and inventor is king. So there is, again, those are the, some of the small details that I think can make a big difference to spurring innovation and commercialization.
Thank you, Dr. Balongaita. Dr. Balisacan, sir, you were cut off earlier. You were saying something about the importance of having more competition amongst our telcos.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I got disconnected. That only tells you how good our internet facility is. But yeah, I was saying that there's really a major challenge for the country to roll out quickly this internet connectivity infrastructure. And the problems is really quite extensive, involving from local governments all the way to national governments, including regulators. And yet, as we address the COVID-19 challenges and the recovery issues, there are also calls to actually even weaken regulators that are supposedly, like the Competition Authority, for example, to supposedly strengthen the capacity of the economy to make markets even work more effectively, even during, and especially even during times like this, because the possibilities for mergers that could turn out to be anti-competitive are quite high during this time. And given an economy like us that is, so to begin with, already highly concentrated, these opportunities for mergers and acquisitions, which are likely to be too many, are likely going to even exacerbate that problem. So I think it's a leadership concern that we need to embrace, that these challenges be addressed. But let me also quickly address that or comment on the investment issue earlier, especially in relation to the OCW. I think that there, Dr. Concepcion was noting the need to provide better information, opportunity information sets to OCWs as to where they could place their money, so that it could help them directly, but also it could help the economy moving forward. I think that I am usually quite allergic to the idea that OCWs, households themselves, do not know where to put their money best. I think that what we should embrace and what we know in our understanding of household dynamics is that they're so much constrained by the information set. So they behave on the basis of the information that they have. I think Dr. Blongeta earlier mentioned about information asymmetry. And I think that's what the problem facing our OCWs and many households. They don't have the much information about what opportunities are there are available, and also that there's this big issue about the investment climate that mentioned by Jeff. I think the big challenge really here is in this country is the improvement in the investment climate. Let me note that when we were doing that ambition natin 2040, it struck us to find when we do a nationwide survey of households that one of the single most ambitions or aspirations of Filipinos is to have a decent home and a home that's detached, and given that, and you frame that in the context of the backlogs in housing, I think that the observation that you see that OCWs, when they have the money, they use that for real estate. That's essentially what it is. That's what they want to see an improvement in their welfare, that dimension of welfare in the housing, and given the backlogs, as I said, even that. Even if they put their money in real estate, that is going to have a major impact, tremendous impact for many years on the economy. Because and you can use this real estate construction industry as a whole as one of the pillars of economic growth for many years. And so I am not too worried about investors or OCW's resources going into real estate because of the nature of the backlogs and the aspirations of Filipinos. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balisacan, for that. Now, we're well over the time allotted to us. So we'd like to thank again our speakers for such very interesting and informative presentations, and also to all the participants, all those who've asked their questions. Thank you for spending time with us. Ma'am Gisela, would you like to give the final words?
Yes, I'm very grateful to our speakers, our distinguished speakers, and to our distinguished participants for staying on with us. And this is supposed to be only for 2 hours, but we're now on 3.5 hours. And it's understandable because this is probably one of the most important sessions in PAASE 40th anniversary symposium. And it concerns our national welfare. So thank you very much to all. And I'm hoping that some of you will keep on following PAASE's activities. So we have an active website. Actually, for those who are members in the audience, we have a campaign to get a Start Fresh lifetime membership fee paid, okay? Because we want to raise some funds for PAASE. We're private, non-government. We also welcome donations to our organization, and we have actually identified about 10, 11 categories of projects that we would like to support. And this would include helping our postgraduate students earn their PhDs abroad. Of course, it's lopsided in terms in favor of the United States, because this is the Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering with its origins in 1980 in the United States. But we're also going to support the writing of policy papers and training of, say, researchers in state universities and colleges, in leading universities in Metro Manila, and likewise the training of our postgraduate students in universities in the United States and elsewhere. So we're trying to create this STI ecosystem that we feel should be regionalized. Okay? So we'd like to showcase some regions that might show how science and technology is improving their lives. So thank you very much, everyone, for your focused attention. In particular, I'd like to thank our former NEDA secretaries who graced this occasion, Secretary Ernie Pernia and Secretary R.C. Balisacan. Also, our academician, Nas Mahar Mangahas. And of course, well, our special guest speaker, now our member in the PAASE, Dr. Emil Bolongaita, and everyone else. Former Dean Ramon Clarete, Dr. Jeff Ducanes, Dr. Mahelaya Viravago, and Dr. Sarah Daway Ducanes. Thank you. Good day, good night, good afternoon to all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.